Good evening. Welcome to the International Spy Museum. I'm Amanda Olke, Adult Education Director here. I'm very excited to have a program on Hitler's monsters. That sounds bad, but it's true, because we have a terrific speaker, Eric Kurlander. He's a professor of history at Stetson University in Florida, and he teaches modern German, European, and world history. Hitler's Monsters is his latest book. It's his 5th book. He's also the author of Living with Hitler, which sounds like a nightmare. Lots of good Halloween jokes with this one. I was intrigued looking around at Eric online. There are lots of interesting, I don't know if you know how much you're tweeted about.
No.
People are constantly referencing your articles, so it's pretty fascinating and a very positive, like, this is the guy who knows what's going on. So now we're going to know all about Nazism and the occult. Thank you, Eric.
All right. Thank you very much, Amanda, for inviting me, to Shauna as well, and Alden Farrow, the publicist at Yale who set this up. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first time in the Spy Museum, which I just saw today for the first time, and it's fantastic. I don't know how many of you have seen the exhibits, but there's even a link to what I'm going to be presenting that I didn't know was going to be there in the James Bond exhibit, so I'll mention that later. Oh, you took mine. Did you? Yeah.
That was a brush pass that shouldn't have happened.
Oh, look, you're very good with intelligence. And so, yeah, and I'm very happy to see a few of my former students in the audience who have obviously done very well and are now living in DC doing various things. So thanks for coming to my former Stetson colleagues. As you see, this is the title, and I'd like to start, and I'm going to proceed this way tonight with a little bit from the book, and then talk through some of the context, and then read some other passages rather than give a formal talk. So I'm going to start with the first paragraph of the book. So early in the blockbuster movie Captain America: The First Avenger, which many of you have probably seen, a Nazi officer enters a small Norwegian town in search of an ancient relic, the Tesseract, and you can see the Tesseract in a couple iterations up there. The Tesseract promises its owner infinite power. It's a cosmic artifact of sorts. We soon find out that the officer, Johannes Schmidt, has imbibed the prototype of a super soldier serum developed by a fringe or border scientist, we'll get to that later, named Abraham Erskine. And you see Erskine there in the original 1940 comic book. Intended to give Schmidt superhuman strength and agility, the serum instead, because it's in a prototype form and he shouldn't have taken it, causes a monstrous transformation, driving the Nazi officer mad and turning his head into a ghastly red skull. Hence, the supervillain, one of the first in Marvel comic book history, the Red Skull. Erskine escapes to America, where he perfects his serum, and that happens to the best of us, don't worry, transfiguring the prototypical 98-pound weakling, there you see him, Steve Rogers, into our hero. Now, Captain America has little time to hone his combat skills before confronting the Red Skull and the insidious occult society known as Hydra, which it turns out pulls the strings behind Hitler and the Third Reich, kind of an analogy to Spectre downstairs in the James Bond exhibit. Now, if you notice, I just wanted to point this out, Baron von Strucker, who's the head of Hydra, and he's in the second Avengers movie, I believe. He's at the beginning of that. That's what it looks like in the Marvel movie. It's very similar to the Wavelsburg, which is Himmler's order castle, where he has Grail ceremonies and a black sun, just to show you the fiction and the history coming together. And that's really the point of starting with Captain America. Captain America contains all the elements of Nazi supernaturalism in popular culture. the connection to occult forces, mad scientists, fantastical weapons, a superhuman master race, a preoccupation with pagan religions, and magical relics supposed to grant the Nazis unlimited power. And of course, the pagan religion stuff comes back with Thor and Loki fighting over the Tesseract, and Thor, the Nordic god, has to take it from his evil brother Loki and bring it to Asgard for protection. Can you all hear me all right? Excellent. So from comic books produced during the Second World War, so while the Nazis are still in power, through 21st century video games like Castle Wolfenstein, from classic science fiction and adventure films like Raiders of the Lost Ark, The Boys from Brazil, to contemporary horror movies like Dead Snow or Hellboy, or superhero franchises like The Avengers and Captain America, our popular culture is awash with these images of the Nazi supernatural, right? Now, we don't have time today, and that's why I decided to kind of focus, to talk about the entire history of Hitler and the occult, right? This book has 9 chapters. They all deal with different aspects of what I just kind of laid out there. So what I thought we'd do, and then leave the rest for question and answer, is I'd give you some background on the historical relationship between Nazism, occultism, and what I'm calling border science, or what they called border science. Then, using some context from the book itself, look at 3 case studies from one chapter, chapter 7, of the Third Reich utilizing border science and occultism for the purposes of military intelligence and propaganda. They did actually use it for purposes that this museum would find very interesting, and so I chose those case studies. And then if we have time, I'll bring up a couple other examples, and then we can, in the question and answer, talk about more expansive things. So for example, traditional occultism, kind of these doctrines like theosophy. How many of you have heard of theosophy or anthroposophy, right, or Ariosophy? Those kind of broader occult doctrines I won't talk about much initially, nor will I talk about pagan or folkish religion, though that's a major part of the book. I will focus more on what they called Grenzwissenschaft, or border science. And so that's what I'd like to do. So let's start with the historical relationship between Nazism and the supernatural. Now, depending on what your background is, you may recognize some of these individuals or writers. And I just want to riff off of this quote from Alfred Rosenberg. Alfred Rosenberg was the ideological czar of the Nazi Party. He was the one who wrote long essays and tomes about what Nazi ideology was, what was wrong with the conventional bourgeois world, the church. And until very recently, people would have characterized Rosenberg and many Nazi leaders, and we'll get to that, as being, I'm talking about mainstream historians, is very disinterested in the occult, right? And one of the ways I got a contract for the book is after one of the early proposals got a peer review, he said, well, this is all fascinating, but there's no history there. I forwarded this quote from Rosenberg himself, and you can see the quote. The success of National Socialism, the unique appearance of the Führer, has no precedent in German history. The consequence is that many Germans, due to their proclivity for the romantic and the mystical, indeed the occult, came to understand the success of National Socialism in this fashion. And he goes on from there. So what is Rosenberg arguing? The reason we were successful is Germans are fascinated by the occult and they associate us with that. Now we'll go on to say that's not necessarily a good thing, but that's a pretty, if you're looking for an archival source saying there's a story to tell, this is a good one. And he was not alone. So Rosenberg gleaned this. Lothar Eisner, who you see up there, Theodor Adorno, both associated with the Frankfurt School of kind of social, scientific, and cultural criticism in the 1920s. They both argued very openly that Nazism drew on occult thinking, supernatural thinking, esoteric thinking. I have a lot of that in the book. She was a film critic who looked at, like her colleague Siegfried Krakauer, another Frankfurt School film critic. Have you heard of the book From Caligari to Hitler? It's a study of expressionism. Anyone, kind of film scholars often cite that book. He and Eisner both argue that the expressionist trend in German culture, the kind of fascination with horror and the macabre and authoritarian personalities, paved the way for Hitler. Adorno said, occultism, like anti-Semitism, which is based on what seems like a science but's really faith-based, religious, mystical thinking, is exactly what facilitated Nazism. So there's a lot of contemporary intellectuals who made that argument. And then Rudolf von Sobotendorf, who we don't have time to go into today, he argued in 1933 the Nazis came from his movement, his occult movement, and the Thule Society, which he co-founded. Some of you might have heard of the Thule Society, the Thule Gesellschaft. We've got Rosenberg, and we've got Rauschning, a guy who wrote a book about interviews he had with Hitler. So there was a very powerful contemporary belief that the Nazis were wrapped up with occult, border science, and pagan religion. And then you get this first generation of what we call historiography, which is the kind of the interpretations that historians make about the past. And some of these are very good scholarly works, like Mosa, Stern, and Goodrich Clark's The Cult Roots of Nazism, which focuses on one secret Aryan cult, really, the Ariosophists, which I'll talk about briefly today. Others, like The Morning of the Magicians, is kind of crypto history, like Trevor Ravencroft's Spear of Destiny. I don't know if you've heard of that as well. But all of a sudden, you get this efflorescence in the 60s and 70s of a belief that Nazism is based in the occult, right? Some of it's good history, some of it's not. But all of a sudden, this contemporary idea, after maybe 15 or 20 years of kind of incubation, becomes a very popular trope. All right. And then, including a colleague of mine from graduate school, some people start researching the occult per se, occultism, esotericism, in the 90s and 2000s, and their arguments are much more skeptical. I would say the general trend in a lot of this work is, first of all, everyone was interested in the occult in the 1890s through 1930s. That's one of the arguments they make. But just as everyone was interested in it, it was also very modern. Everyone is trying New Age spirituality and thinks that maybe they have ESP and they're going to, parapsychologists to test them and see if they really have it, right? There's still people doing that today. We don't have to get to those analogies yet, but we could later on. And so their argument is, why this obsession with Nazism, they call it, when everyone in Central Europe, and even if you read Anne Harrington and others in France and Britain and America, were going to their spiritual gurus and trying out new religions. If anything, that just says that there's nothing really uniquely interesting about the relationship between Nazism, occultism, border science, what have you. The problem with this argument, as you'll see in my own book, is it doesn't have to be a direct connection. That is, not everyone who practices some version of occultism, just like not every Christian supports the same religious doctrine or political party, has to support it for it to be influential, right? For that way of thinking or those doctrines to be influential. So my work, what I'm going to talk about today, accepts their premise that everyone was interested in these border sciences and occult ideas, that they're not quintessentially backwards, but that more than any political party of that era in Germany or elsewhere, the Nazis drew on it, while other parties were skeptical or so. What does that have to do with social and political, issues, right? So that kind of gives you a sense of the context in which we'll be arguing today. All right. Any questions so far? I want to give you a chance to ask questions because I just went through a lot of stuff pretty quickly. Okay. We'll save them for the end. Now, a quick case study here before we get to a quick example of Nazi anti-occultism, which is in the 5th chapter of my book, before we get to the military intelligence and espionage. So one thing that people often bring up is when the Nazis came to power, they attacked occultism. They attacked border scientists. Okay, and I want to talk about what that means, what the differences between border science and occultism. You all understand occult as being into witchcraft and secret forces and clairvoyance, dowsing, divining, right, with a divining rod. What scientific occultists called radiesthesia. So I differentiate in the book between occult doctrines like theosophy, Ariosophy, anthroposophy, right, which are holistic views of the world that incorporate astrology and parapsychology, but also have kind of origin myths, right? Like there were root races, 7 root races at some point. Madame Blavatsky started this with the Theosophists. And different races had different powers or skills or histories, and then there was some kind of miscegenation or a flood or an ice age, and the greatest race kind of started to die out, except maybe some of their high priests made it to Tibet. This is more the religious aspect of the book. But my argument is that that is quintessentially occultism in this area. Occultism is kind of an overarching doctrine. Border science are practices by people who sometimes are occultists, but sometimes they're just Nazis, right? Or your local doctor who's got a homeopathic background, right? And the idea is these are scientific practices that mainstream science and medicine don't accept, which is why the term border science comes around in the 20s and 30s. Grenzwissenschaft, it has multiple meanings, and it's not the same thing as occult. The Grenzwissenschaften are practices that are on the borders of what's accepted by mainstream science, so that's number one in terms of border. They investigate border phenomena, right? So ESP, talking to the dead, things that are on the border of what can actually be known. In that sense, they're border sciences, right? Clairvoyance, astrology. And they use the term because they mean interdisciplinarity as well. You cross the borders from one scientific practice to another. So border scientists like to claim that they're not tied to one materialist view or, a very rigid view of what physics is or chemistry is. They're willing to use all doctrines or all practices to come to the truth in some organic way. Why is that important? Because very often the Nazis, as you'll see here, will pursue occultists as individuals who claim to be the head of a sect, like anthroposophy or Freemasons, but they don't attack the scientific occultism or the border sciences they practice. Does that make sense? And I think that's a really important distinction that no historians have yet made, because what bothers Nazis is sectarianism, that you're not following the Third Reich, the ideology, that Hitler isn't your end-all and be-all. But when it comes to the epistemology, the sources of knowledge, the approaches to knowledge, they don't mind stuff that we would consider occult, provided it's framed as a border science. So to give you an example of that, which is a big deal in the field, maybe you haven't heard of this, Rudolf Hess, who was a deputy Führer, right? He was technically in the party the second-ranking guy. He really wasn't. Even before 33, Himmler and Goering and others had displaced him. But in theory, he's the guy who would replace Hitler if Hitler got killed, and everyone was trying to kill him, right? He got assassinated. There were 10 assassination plots that they uncovered or something. Hess, like Himmler, like many of the people we'll talk about today, was very interested in border science and occultism, and had been practicing it pretty openly. He started a New Age hospital for homeopathic and border scientific practices in 1934. He would have conferences where he would promote that kind of stuff. Even Hitler sent a letter of congratulations in 1935 to one of the big astrological congresses. So a lot of Nazi leaders dabbled or were immersed in this. But Hess was one of the more prominent ones. And in 1941, May of 1941, as many of you might know, he got frustrated. I mean, it's complex what his motivations were, but he was clearly frustrated with being marginalized, and he was frustrated that Hitler was about to open a second front in the Soviet Union, which he saw as disastrous. He was right. And so he thought he would go fly, because he was a decent pilot, he would go fly to Britain on his own and negotiate peace on behalf of Hitler and Third Reich. So I think on May 8th, 1941, he takes off. Now, there is some evidence he did consult with his astrologer, as he and Himmler would do for everything, right, before he left. And then he crash landed, got captured. The British said, come on, this guy's nuts, and just wanted to do a psychological evaluation. They didn't want to negotiate with him. This was a scandal, obviously, in the middle of the war. Hitler was livid. He said, what's wrong with this guy? How could he do it? And then Bormann and Heydrich come in, and Rosenberg, and say, well, it's because of his occultism, right? He was obsessed with occult gurus, and that's why he did it. So Hitler says, okay, finally, it's been 8 years. We've used kid gloves until now, but it's time to go after these people, okay? Which is typical of Hitler. Like, he gets focused on something briefly and then loses focus. And for about a month, there was something called the Hess Action. You see the wreckage of the plane. You see the order from Heydrich saying that we've got to pursue this, all these occultists. He lists all of them. But it only lasts a few weeks. And I think that's really important. The only reason it only lasts a few weeks, and I'll get to that here, is because what has often been castigated as pseudoscience in the Third Reich might be characterized as a genuine openness to the very boundaries of the knowable, to border science and so-called scientific occultism. That's one of the premises I want to make before we look at our case studies, that the Nazis may have gone after sectarians, but they liked the practices that those sectarians saw as important, the border science. Now, there were limits, of course. Anyone professing a direct connection to the divine or supernatural might raise the state's hackles, particularly if such individuals appeared likely to contravene the state's political or ideological goals. Okay, so Hess embarrasses the Third Reich. They blame astrologers. They go arrest some astrologers. So, or anthroposophists who wanted to have their own institutes. They might go after them. At the same time, however, the occult could help justify dubious scientific practices, even as it acted as a wellspring of new thinking and experimentation. And the Second World War saw an efflorescence of such thinking. Okay? So that's the context before we get to military intelligence. Now, in March 1940, Hans Bender, who had become Germany's leading parapsychologist, and there you see a picture of him with Uri Geller from the 70s. He's an older gentleman on the top. But in his 30s, he had become the leading parapsychologist, scientific parapsychologist in Germany. He wrote a pessimistic letter in March of 1940 to Karl Kraft. Karl Kraft is down there. He was a famous Swiss astrologer. Some of you may have heard of him. We'll get to him later. Since 1937, they had both witnessed growing restrictions against occultism. This escalating repression, Hans Bender feared, would be exacerbated by the outbreak of the war, because they could see that now that the war had broken out, they were, the euthanasia program, they were going after gypsies, the policies against the Jews were getting worse. So he's worried that since they're anti-sectarian, they're going to confuse occultism with real scientific, border scientific occultism that he practices, and it's going to get worse for us. Okay? And Kraft wrote him back immediately and said, about the prospects of border sciences in our generation, I put the quote up there. Can you read these quotes from that far away? Excellent. He said, I'm not as pessimistic as you, especially in government circles, he insisted. They are seeking people who have something to say in terms of border scientific research. And he used the term Grenzwissenschaft. Now, Kraft knew what he was talking about. By March 1940, Kraft was working closely with Goebbels in the propaganda ministry and the Reich intelligence services to produce propaganda and wage psychological warfare against the Allies. Many of Kraft's fellow experts in astrology and divining dowsing, radiesthesia that I mentioned earlier, would be recruited as well. You see Wilhelm Wolff, Ludwig Straniak, Gerda Walter. These are some of the figures who would get recruited. Bender's own border scientific research began to receive official sponsorship only during the war. So before the war, he was kind of tolerated. During the war, Himmler and indirectly Hitler start giving money to his university institute, this parapsychologist. For just as the conflict released bottled up economic energies, it also led to a greater Nazi willingness to experiment and exploit border science in the interests of foreign policy, propaganda, and military science. Okay, and that's where our case studies come in. For example, Nostradamus and astrology. Now, before September 1939, as I suggested, the Third Reich had been ambivalent about sponsoring astrology in any official capacity. So Himmler and Hess had intervened to make sure that astrology per se, the practice of scientific astrology, was not banned. But astrologers and people who belonged to astrological societies had been reined in, okay? As had the Catholic Church, the Protestants, Jehovah's Witnesses, even radical pan-German nationalists who hadn't joined the Nazi Party were reined in. Basically anyone who wasn't in the Nazi Party. That's important to point out. But with the outbreak of the war, any lingering reservations about enlisting border science for the benefit of the regime dissipated. Only 4 days into the war, Rosenberg, remember Rosenberg, the one critical of occultism? Rosenberg's attack dog in occult matters, a guy named Kurt Kissauer, produced a policy paper, okay? This is a high-ranking official with a policy paper entitled, quote, "Astrology as a Means to Influence Public Opinion," unquote. The report indicated that the British had used fake horoscopes to good effect in Germany. Okay, and the SS noted the same thing independently of Rosenberg's office, that Germans really did seem susceptible to this kind of propaganda. If Germans were susceptible to occult thinking, why not employ similar astrological propaganda against the Allies? That was the point of Kissauer's policy paper. Well, while he's thinking about this and while Himmler's collecting all this astrological stuff, Goebbels, of all people, on October 30th, 1939, so 8 weeks into the war, reported on a ministerial conference during which he announced, in his Reich propaganda ministry, that he was examining astrological writing to, quote, determine himself whether there were any inherent dangers, unquote. 2 weeks later, he brought a letter from Karl Kraft himself, okay, to Hitler. He'd gotten a letter, or the intelligence service had gotten a letter from Kraft on 2 November. And he brought this letter to a lunch meeting with Hitler. The letter had predicted that Johann Georg Elser would attempt to assassinate Hitler shortly thereafter. And there was a guy who tried to kill him when he returned to the Bürgerbräu Keller in Munich to give a speech. There was a bomb under there and he barely escaped. So here Kraft, this astrologer, had just sent a letter predicting an assassination attempt. So Goebbels brings us to lunch with Hitler. He says, isn't this fascinating? And Hitler said he was fascinated as well and asked Goebbels to explain the details. How did you get this? Who's this Kraft guy? Himmler, who was also at lunch and was soliciting astrological materials for his own occult library, okay, took great interest in the conversation and agreed that the letter and its prediction were genuine. So you've got Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels at lunch saying, you know what, astrology may just work. If we had followed his advice, we would have, you never would have been in there. Goebbels was clearly encouraged by Hitler and Himmler's response. As he reported in his diary 2 days later, quote, I broached the idea of Nostradamus to my colleagues in the propaganda ministry for the first time. The whole world is full of mystical superstition. Why shouldn't we exploit that in order to undermine the enemy front? So the question here is, does Goebbels really believe it, or does he see it as a way of manipulating the public? That's a question that I deal with in the book, and I could kind of, by case study, show you where I think different Nazis stand. But what's fascinating is the war breaks out, and all of a sudden you've got these high-ranking Nazis saying, hey, maybe we should work with this astrological stuff. Now, in my chapter, I go through in detail, month by month, how Goebbels first has his diplomats in the propaganda ministry try to work with Nostradamus' quatrains. They don't know anything about astrology, so their propaganda is kind of crappy, right? So then Goebbels says, well, why don't I just hire this Kraft guy? Which isn't hard to do because the SS and the SD, the intelligence service, have been monitoring him for a while. Not only because he's an occultist, but because he's been trying to convince diplomats to listen to him, because he knows what's going to happen in the war and in the future. Like there was a Romanian diplomat, Virgil Talea. The whole affair, basically, he tries to tell him what to tell the British, and the SS is getting frustrated, but they don't arrest him. The point is, he's on the regime's radar already before he sends the letter. So Goebbels like, why don't you come work for me? That's why Kraft's so excited a few weeks later and writes Bender, I'm getting paid to read Nostradamus quatrains and tell them what's going to happen. This is fantastic. But it's not just Kraft. Goebbels had gone to this guy named Kritzinger, Hans Kritzinger, who was a ballistics expert, but also a dowsing expert. Because he was a dowsing expert, he was an astrology expert, because these aren't real sciences. You can be an expert on everything, right? And Kritzinger's the guy who said, Kraft's really good. You should get him. He's a really good scientific astrologer. Well, Goebbels goes back to him and says, do you want to work for me? He's like, well, I'm really busy doing dowsing stuff, but maybe you can hire this guy named Georg Lucht, who's also a great astrologer. So by February, he's got Kraft, Lucht, and all his kind of leading propaganda guys looking over Nostradamus, finding reasons why Belgium and the Netherlands should capitulate, predictably, right? And Norway. Why? Because they invade Norway in April and Belgium, the Netherlands in May. They're literally, you can piece together how Goebbels, the lead propagandist, is using Nostradamus to come up with propaganda for why Allied countries should capitulate and why German soldiers should be confident that they're going to win. Okay? I'm not going to recount all of that here. It's fascinating, other than to say that this really happened. Okay? I want to move on to our second case study, which is, I'll give you the context here, the two case studies which are related. So, waging war with border science. On 12 September 1943, the SS captain Otto Skorzeny, who's downstairs in the James Bond exhibit, the historian for the Spy Museum has argued that Skorzeny's the model possibly for Blofeld or for one of the other Bond villains with a scar. You'll see him in a minute. So this Special Forces captain, the SS, Otto Skorzeny, conducted a daring raid on the Campo Imperatore Hotel in Italy's Gran Sasso Mountains. His mission was to liberate Il Duce, Benito Mussolini, whom the Italian people had deposed and arrested in the wake of the Allied landings in Sicily a couple weeks earlier. Now, for weeks, the Italians had been moving Mussolini from one obscure site to another. The goal was to prevent just this kind of rescue operation. It would have been a real propaganda coup if the Axis had gotten Mussolini back and could set up a puppet state, right, in northern Italy. But somehow, Skorzeny found the dictator's location, and in a matter of hours, his airborne troops swooped in their DFS-230 gliders and defeated Mussolini's captors without firing a shot. And I'll show you the picture of what we're going to get to that in a minute. Here's the operation I'm talking about, okay? You'll see how they're linked, both of these. Whisked off to Vienna, Mussolini was named leader of the new Italian Social Republic, a German-dominated rump state desperate to hold off the Allied advance. But in the midst of Germany's last offensive in the east, Operation Citadel, the disaster at Kursk, all the other things going on, obviously the Sicily invasion, this might have been the greatest and last major military operation that you could deem successful and a great kind of propaganda coup at the same time. We found Mussolini, rescued him, there's hope, right, for the Axis, right? So Operation Oak constituted one of the Third Reich's last great public relation victories. Nevertheless, the most remarkable aspect of the raid was not Operation Oak, which is a technical term for rescuing Mussolini. It was Operation Mars, the intelligence operation that ostensibly located Mussolini in the first place. Evidence suggests that the information on Mussolini's whereabouts was pieced together by conventional intelligence operations, we'll get to that in a minute, and breaking of Allied radio codes. But Himmler and Schellenberg, who had replaced Heydrich as head of the SD, insisted they'd garnered this information from an expert team of occultists assembled in a villa under SS administration. Now, Operation Mars wasn't the only time that astrologers, clairvoyants, or diviners would be recruited to help the regime. As you can see here, for 4 years after the Hess action, the SS employed border scientists in military technology and research, seeking ways to improve morale, extract intelligence, and exert mind control. Even the German Navy joined in, assembling a group of diviners and astrologers to locate Allied battleships. So I want to talk about that first, and then we'll get to Operation Mars. Now, after something called world ice theory, which I don't have time to get into today, we can talk about it in the question and answer, the area of border science that was probably most valuable in the Third Reich, or most popular, wasn't astrology. It was radiesthesia. It was divining or dowsing, whether with a stick or a piece of iron on a string, right? That was seen as the most reliable border science. Many Nazi leaders, notably Himmler and Hess, believed in the existence of cosmic forces or so-called earth rays, Erdstrahlen, radiation, that could be detected and harnessed with the proper training. Even Hitler had ordered one of Germany's most famous diviners to check the Reich Chancellery for malignant forms of death rays that were under the earth, and were going to somehow give him cancer. Hess famously used to sleep with magnets below and above his bed to fend off these terrible death rays. Goebbels also hired dowsers like Kritzinger, I mentioned him a few minutes ago, to assist with Nostradamus propaganda. But the strangest and most telling experiment in radiesthesia was probably the one initiated not by the Nazi Party, which shows you how widespread it is, but the Navy itself. So one of the big myths that's been punctured the last 30 years in all sorts of ways is that the military was somehow insulated, like the church, from all of this crazy stuff. Well, we now know that leaders of the church, especially Protestants, and leaders of the military were almost as immersed in whether it's race science or border science in this stuff as the Nazis were, right? And this is an example of that. There's not a clear line between the sober, technologically adept and conservative military and the crazy Nazis. There's really a spectrum there that they're all on. So by the summer of 1942, the British had begun to turn the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. As many of you know, the battle between the U-boats who were trying to sink as many convoys as possible to prevent supplies getting to Europe and North Africa, and then using radar, sonar, destroyers, and other things to find the U-boats, right? Now, the success of the British and the Americans by late 42 had nothing to do with dowsing, okay? To locate enemy submarines, the British employed quite natural scientific methods, namely radar and sonar. They were aided in these efforts by sophisticated code breaking and the extensive use of American convoys. But German Navy officials were confused. They weren't sure how they were eluding them or finding submarines. And one of the most confused about the shift in the Battle of the Atlantic was a U-boat captain named Hans Roeder. And there you see him, Captain Hans Roeder. He's not some guy writing comic books in his spare time, you know, Captain America and whatnot, and sending weird screeds to the government. He is a Navy captain, right? A science expert in the Navy Patent Office. And an amateur pendulum dowser, right? Because who isn't in Germany at this time? So Roeder was convinced the British were employing dowsing, divining as a means to locate German ships. As a countermeasure, Roeder suggested that the Navy begin employing border scientific methods. So we're really behind, we haven't yet weaponized this stuff. Were Roeder operating in the Royal Navy, his suggestion to set up an officially sponsored pendulum institute would likely have been dismissed as outrageous. And we know the British and Americans had these some fringe things going on, but they never got any money, and it was kind of a joke, and all the efforts were focused on conventional things and massive undertakings like the search for an atomic bomb, right? And yet Roeder was operating in the Third Reich, where many ranking party officials and military men were open to border scientific doctrines. And I could go through a lot of examples of things the Navy and Army and Air Force had been experimenting in. I have other examples in the book. But let's just say that given this context, it comes as no surprise that in September 1942, Roeder received approval from the Navy Intelligence Service, so this is official, for his Pendulum Institute. Its purpose was, quote, to pinpoint the position of enemy convoys at sea by means of pendulums and other supernatural devices so that the German submarine flotillas could be certain of sinking them, unquote. As Rear Admiral Gerhard Wagner, chief of the Navy's operational department, admitted, Roeder, the, quote, pendulum user, was well known to all of us. From the point of view of those days, his work was not that unusual. After all, one was constantly thinking about new techniques, and if someone came and claimed to be able to achieve something by way of a certain method, no matter how crazy, he doesn't say that, it was a matter of course that it was given the opportunity. That's a very official way of saying, yeah, we had no problem with it back then. We understand it sounds nuts today. Now that he had gained official approval and financing, Roeder set out convening, and this is a quote from a witness, a strange band of psychics, pendulum users, tattva researchers, astrologers, astronomers, ballisticians, and mathematicians. These individuals included the Luftwaffe astronomer/astrologer Wilhelm Hartmann, Wilhelm Wulff, who was freed from a concentration camp to become Himmler's personal astrologer, and Straniak, Ludwig Straniak. I showed him, he's up there. He was the most famous scientific dowser in Germany. He wrote all these books about secret powers that you could find with these dowsing rods. He was the first dowser to claim he could teach lay people how to employ a pendulum to locate large metal objects hundreds of miles away. Sounds a lot like enemy ships, right? I wonder why he said he could do that during World War II. Roeder also tapped the prominent astrologers Kritzinger and Kraft. They're still around. The latter recruited directly from prison. I'm not going to get into why Kraft went to prison, but it had nothing to do with occultism. Basically, he was totally rejecting the Nostradamus orders he was being given, and he went rogue and said, all these things were going to happen that Goebbels didn't like. But anyway, they take him out of prison, throw him in this institute. Gerda Walter, a parapsychologist who had weaved in and out of Heydrich's crosshairs for years. Gerda Walter used to claim that she would talk to Ernst Röhm, the dead head of the SA. At night, he would come to her and they would have these nice conversations about why Hitler killed him. They recruit her to help out, okay? The leaders of the German Society for Scientific Occultism that had been banned, they decide to bring the two guys in, Fritz Kvada and Konrad Schupa. So they're brought in despite the Hess action I mentioned. This is a year after they supposedly were going to wipe out occultism. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details again of this institute, except to say that it lasted for a period of months, did absolutely nothing productive, and no one paid any kind of cost for that because it was seen, oh, well, maybe we were faulty in some measurements, but it was a worthwhile operation. In fact, all the occultists, and this is the last case study, that were operating in that realm end up working for the SS a year later to find Mussolini, and that's what I want to close with. So according to a number of Navy officers, the Institute produced no meaningful results. Nevertheless, the Institute indicates the Third Reich, fueled by wartime necessity, had moved into a new, more open phase of border scientific experimentation. The search for Benito Mussolini is emblematic of these continuing efforts. The inspiration for Operation Mars likely grew out of the Pendulum Institute. So very few historians even recognize these things were going on, much less see how they're linked. But it's clear that the Pendulum Institute brought the SS into closer contact with a number of prominent border scientists, including Wilhelm Wolff. Himmler's masseur and confidant Felix Kirsten claims to have facilitated Wolff's rise by soliciting a horoscope of Hitler, which was forwarded to Arthur Nebe, who was head of the criminal police under the SS. And he thought, well, this is a really good horoscope. So he forwarded that on potentially to Himmler. It's equally likely that Wolff's yeoman work for the Pendulum Institute, Wolff claims that he was able to find these ships, unlike other people, brought him to the attention of Nebe, Schellenberg, and eventually Himmler. Whatever the reason, on 28 July 1943, almost a year to the date after the Pendulum Institute opened, Himmler ordered the Gestapo to bring Wolff to Berlin. There he met Nebe, who instructed him as to the particulars of his mission. Mussolini had been kidnapped, and Himmler wanted Wolff to locate Il Duce by astrological means. Now, Wolff was only the first of many occultists contacted. A few days after Wolff's interview with Nebe, so they're giving them interviews to see if they're serious, right? The seer, the clairvoyant Kurt Munk, was taken out of Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where he ended up after the Hesse action, to Berlin, where he was asked to locate Mussolini. So he corroborates this. He's like, they just took me out of the camp and put me in Berlin. This is great. Over the next few days, nearly 40 more representatives of the occult sciences were assembled in a comfortable villa in Wannsee, probably Nebe's International Criminal Police headquarters. They didn't know anything about the way that the SS worked, but it seems to be where they were assembled. Upon arrival, many of them demanded and were given copious amounts of food, alcohol, and cigarettes. Schellenberg would in fact complain that, quote, these seances cost us much money, as these scientists need good food, drink, and tobacco to be effective. Schellenberg's SS colleague, a guy named Wilhelm Hotel, was more sympathetic to their seemingly Epicurean requests. No wonder that the poor devils, having lived on starvation rations of the concentration camps for years, exploited the opportunity to enjoy honeypots, cigarettes, and alcohol. Like, come on, it's tough in those concentration camps. Why don't we give them the good life for a while? All this food and drink did nothing to dull their preternatural senses. Wolff argued that his own calculations, which took most of August and early September, because he was serious, right, were instrumental in locating Mussolini. So too did Munk, who claimed that the SS produced an ersatz pendulum and a map of Italy on which Munk identified a dead spot in the Abruzzo Mountains. So they're all claiming they found him, right, after the war. Most documentation indicates that it was the conventional intelligence of the ST and the SS, assisted by the captain of a German seaplane squadron, that pieced together Mussolini's location. Years later, so after this has all been deemed crazy, this is very important historically, by the 50s and 60s, a lot of the Nazis and Germans and Navy leaders saying, oh yeah, we didn't really believe that, right? So years later, Hotel himself would admit that it was probably conventional intelligence that located Il Duce. The whole operation, he suggested in a memoir, had been organized to placate Himmler, who of course had committed suicide, right? Whose belief in the occult sciences were well known. However, contemporary accounts by Hotel and others tell a different story. So it's interesting to note that Hotel's earliest memoir of the experience, written before the negative post-war connotation associated with the Nazi occult, claimed that the astrologers and dowsers had indeed been successful. So here's a high-ranking SS guy saying, no, it worked. It's clearly the fact that they had occult powers. Equally significant is Schellenberg's account. Now, this is really fascinating because Schellenberg, the guy over there who replaced Heydrich, he famously would have Wolff come down for a drink to his office and say, so what's Himmler asking you to research now in the stars? What have you been telling him? As a way to kind of figure out what Himmler's next plans were. Because, Himmler would listen to his astrologer, which suggests he was a little bit skeptical. But Schellenberg, in his own account, says that the astrologers and diviners somehow located Mussolini despite having, quote, no contact to the outside world, unquote. Scorzeni himself, right, the model for all these Bond villains, supposedly, reported after the war that the SS had relied on, quote, seers and astrologers to glean Mussolini's whereabouts. So at least at the time, they seem to have thought this stuff worked. Such accounts indicate that many Nazis, and not only Himmler, took Operation Mars seriously. So does the fact that Himmler, Neba, and Schellenberg extracted more than 40 occultists from all over Germany, including the concentration camps. You have to understand, during the war, it was very hard to get out of a concentration camp. Usually, when you went in, you stayed into the end of the war, you got killed. The fact that they're taking them out is remarkable, but get this. Move them to a luxurious villa in Wannsee. Himmler even followed through on his promise to grant occultists, quote, their freedom, as well as 100,000 Reichsmarks if they were successful. When Munch, remember that guy who was taken out of Sachsenhausen, submitted his petition for release, the camp commander, no doubt nonplussed by the request, like, you want to get out of the concentration camp again, countered with the option of a cushier position as camp elder. So you can be a capo. I'm not letting you out of the concentration camp. The astrologer insisted on his full release, citing his work on behalf of, quote, the liberation of Mussolini. After the commander contacted the SS leadership, Munch was freed. So either Himmler or Schellenberg said, yeah, he really did help us. You got to let him out. Wolf, the guy who was also in a concentration camp and was charging thousands of marks. So it was illegal to exploit people with occult means. That was one of the things the Nazis did pursue that was already in the Weimar Republic. If you were basically telling people whatever they wanted to hear to make money off of them, claiming you had magic powers, you could be arrested or fined. Wolf was doing this all the time. That's why he was initially arrested. But after the Pendulum Institute and the Mussolini thing, Wolf received amnesty and followed up with a request, this is fantastic, that the SS return all his books and other occult materials that the Gestapo had confiscated in the Hess action more than 2 years earlier. In late 1943, Neba ordered the return of all of Wolf's library, and a few months later, Wolf became Himmler's personal astrologer. Okay? So, I don't want to go much further other than to say there's a lot of other examples beyond military intelligence that we just talked about. The use of border science in racial resettlement and Eastern colonization is something we could talk about in the question and answer. Biodynamic agriculture, which comes out of anthroposophy, and settlement in the East. That's another theme I thought I'd throw out there. Human experiments in the Holocaust, I argue in the book, are directly linked to this kind of thinking and these doctrines. And then finally, miracle weapons, supernatural partisans, and the collapse of the Third Reich. You literally, and I will end with this, have a point in late 44 and 45 when Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels are creating a werewolf partisan unit. Okay, they call them werewolves because werewolves on the Folkish right have always been a positive monster. That's Germanic, lives in the woods, is masculine, goes back to Odin and Thor. To fight vampires, the Slavic and Jewish interlopers from the East. And even ethnic Germans fleeing Serbia reported on being attacked by Slavic vampires, who were really communist partisans, okay? I'm not making this up. So even the end of the war can be seen as a fight between, that's why I use the term Twilight, Nazi vampires and Slavic or Jewish, or Nazi werewolves and Slavic or Jewish vampires. So I'll leave it at that. Some basic conclusions to get back to a more academic frame of mind. Number one, magic, occultism, and border science were generally taken quite seriously by the leaders of the Third Reich, but especially after 39, which is remarkable. Instead of letting occultists languish in concentration camps after the 1937 ban on astrology or the 1941 Hess action, many Nazi leaders hired the Reich's most accurate astrologers, diviners, pendulum dowsers, anthroposophists, and world ice theorists to produce propaganda, provide military intelligence, locate enemy battleships, enhance agricultural production techniques, and instruct German soldiers how to fight without regard for their own safety. Indeed, many Nazi leaders took the opportunity of the more restrictive legal environment after 37, and especially the Hess action, to enlist out-of-work occultists for their own purposes. So think about this. They make it impossible to practice occultism in the private sector, then say, hey, you've got nothing to do, come work for us. right? Confiscated materials were not destroyed, but made it to Himmler and other leading SS men's personal libraries, or amazingly, were loaned out to Germany's most famous parapsychologist, Hans Bender, remember him, who was encouraged to open his own institute for the study of border science at the new Reich University of Strasbourg. Finally, the selective tolerance of the supernatural might have waxed and waned due to changing circumstances and the omnipresent fear that occultism and border science could, like Christianity, be manipulated to the detriment of the regime. It is sectarian after all, right? But Nazi paranoia regarding alternative ideological loyalties did not preclude utilizing occultism and border science to gain power, shape propaganda and policy, and pursue their dreams of racial utopia and empire. Thank you. 50 minutes, so.
That was amazing and scary, and I think we'll have to open a Pendulum Institute here at some point. Anybody have any questions?
I was wondering what the connection was with the Holocaust with this.
Right. So it's a great question. There's a lot there. I would say there's all three of the strands of my research, the occultism, the pagan religion, and the border science come together in the Holocaust. So on the one hand, you have a eugenical theories that have left the boundaries of mainstream science. So eugenics in the West, it's horrible, and ultimately most of it's pseudoscience, right? It doesn't really work, it's not practicable. But the reason it didn't expand is because mainstream biologists and anthropologists are like, what are you doing with that syphilis experiment? You haven't proved anything. And most of the scientists, and this is, you need this background to understand the difference, right? Who were practicing eugenics said, you're right, we can't, there's double-blind tests. It's too bad we killed all those poor African Americans, but it isn't really working, right? Eugenics doesn't make sense. There were no massive programs of eugenics that lasted. In the Third Reich, they didn't really care whether it was accepted by international peer review. So they would talk in Darwinian and eugenical ways, but they're really getting the ideas from Ariosophy and anthroposophy of root races and Atlantis and world ice theory. The idea that there are superior races and inferior races, that some have monstrous qualities and abilities, others are superhuman. So when you think in those terms, and the Jews are the worst of all races, and you're in a period of dearth and you're fighting against the Jewish Bolshevist menace, all of a sudden eliminating Jews is not a complex eugenical issue of, well, which Jews do we eliminate and are they partially German, becomes they're monsters that have to be gotten rid of. Now, where do we see that reinforced? We see that reinforced in the views of Jews as vampires coming out of folklore. So Hitler, Himmler, Rosenberg, all these analogies or just literal like equations of Jews to parasitic monsters or literally vampires who like sleep under the earth and come out at night to attack Aryan women and suck out their life force and corrupt them. This is not just a Nazi thing. I mean, there's examples, even the mainstream film Nosferatu is seen as a caricature of an East European Jewish interloper with superhuman powers over an Aryan. I mean, there's all sorts of cultural studies, interpretations, but I'm arguing that these things reinforce each other. So the folklore and pagan religion and kind of mysticism that informs their anti-Semitism is linked to the eugenics. And then the third thing is this border scientific idea of living space that also has a tradition on the folkish right. The idea that we need blood and soil that's pure, where we can have German peasants, warrior peasants who can fight against the Slavic and Jewish hordes. And when you combine all three in war, and you can start to see why they say, well, we need to eliminate the Jews and secondarily the Slavs to have a pure German empire. Does that make sense? I give a lot more detail in the book, but all three of those things reinforce each other.
Eric, do you mind doing a quick touch on world ice, if you can do such a thing?
Yeah, so world ice theory was invented by an amateur scientist or kind of popular writer in the 1890s, a guy named Hans Horbiger, an Austrian. And later on, that's a big deal. Like Hitler, he's this brilliant technically trained specialist who understands things better than mainstream scientists, right? It came to him in a dream. He had a dream that there were giant blocks of ice smashing into each other, out in the cosmos, and that must explain everything. And because he didn't know science, he got an amateur astronomer named Philip Thought to write with him a book called Glacial Cosmogony, which I think came out in 1912. And immediately, already, mainstream scientists, geologists, geographers, this is like, one of them famously said, if you just replaced ice with olive oil in the book, it would be no less convincing, right? I mean, it just was meaningless. It was like a religion he had created, that giant blocks of ice smashed into each other, and there were moons of ice, and when they hit the earth, they created a flood, and all the frost giants did well for a while, but then they died out, and the Aryans, lost their civilization. Atlantis collapsed. Fit in perfectly, by the way, with the folkish occult ideas of the time. And so in the 20s and 30s, right-wing thinkers said, well, this is a great science. This isn't Jewish. There's no Einstein that we've got to worry about, or Freud with world ice theory. And then Hitler and Himmler sponsored it in the Third Reich. And I have a whole part of a chapter that goes into the sponsorship of world ice theory. There's a belief that the reason they didn't equip properly for Stalingrad is because they thought that Aryans are more immune to winter because of world ice theory, and therefore the Russians would suffer like they did in World War I because they're inferior and don't have these superpowers, but the Germans will do okay. There's some evidence of that, yeah.
Anybody else? Oh, David?
I'm curious what insight you have into German public opinion on some of these issues. You've talked a lot about certain leaders, captains, and others, but what about the people? What sources do we have about what the German people bought into?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And what's wonderful about I showed you some of those works, more revisionist works from the 90s and 2000s. They lay that groundwork for me. So they show the proliferation of border scientific and astrological and occult thinking from the 1890s on. So their argument is that if you were a bourgeois German or Austrian who hung out in a Vienna or Munich, Vienna cafe, Munich beer hall, you believed in something that I talked about. So their only difference from my argument is that, well, that didn't make you more susceptible to fascism than anyone else. That there's, bless you, that liberalism and socialism and all these other movements are just as attractive to you as someone who believes in world ice theory as fascism would be. I'm arguing that's not the case. Like, the empirical research shows that the people who are most invested in this tend to support the fascist parties. But the fact is, everyone, according to them, is interested in it. Now, I show in the book that even Nazis recognize, or Nazi-affiliated scientists who don't like occultism, that the socialists seem immune to it, and the liberals. And they acknowledge that while liberals and socialists called into question all our traditional values, which helped breed fascism, which is good, it's not their fault that we have these crazy ideas like world ice theory. That's the fault of the fascists who seem to kind of support that. So even within the party, there's a recognition that if you were a materialist Marxist or a secular liberal or a very traditional Christian, you didn't find this stuff interesting. Now, my colleagues, revisionist colleagues, would argue, oh no, they were interested too. I don't see as much evidence. If you were an educated liberal or a socialist, you were much less likely to visit an astrologer, or like Ludendorff, think that there's weird conspiracies of people who can manipulate gold and force your train to crash with mind waves and all these other things that right-wing thinkers seem to believe. That you can smell a Jew hundreds of meters away because they're from a different race. Yeah. Good question, though.
There's in the book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, is a really fascinating account of this man, William Houston Chamberlain, or maybe I got the name.
Houston Stewart Chamberlain.
Yeah, right. That he was like the spiritual father of Nazism, and then he was traveling up from Italy, and he had a vision, and he got off the train and just sat and wrote a book, completely possessed, completely channeled the book.
The foundations of the 19th century.
Right, and that book actually was the spiritual guide of Hitler and all the people But you haven't mentioned him. Does he?
Yeah, I mentioned him in the book.
Oh,
So,
okay.
first of all, Chamberlain is emblematic of a whole kind of, and this gets us to some of the pagan religion stuff. So, Germans in the post-Romantic era decided, for all sorts of reasons, many Germans and Austrians, that traditional Judeo-Christian identity, Greco-Roman identity, classical, all this heritage that in the Enlightenment many Germans still embraced as a common Western heritage, were really the French and British view of the European world, and that Germans were slightly different. And part of that was a search for a new heritage, which they found in a kind of common Indo-Aryan culture, coming out of northwest India and Persia. And lots of thinkers who weren't racist also were fascinated by what Germans called Indology, the field of studying India and Indo-Aryan science and religion and culture. Chamberlain was one of these folkish thinkers. He was actually British, but he hung out all the time in Germany, learned German, married Wagner's daughter. Hitler loved him, as you pointed out, who lent a kind of scientific sheen to this idea that there are these superior races. You can see how close this is to the occult doctrines at the same time, that came out of an Indo-Aryan civilization. There may have been a flood. So the racist Germans who embraced this idea said it was originally a proto-Nordic people who, after the flood and the collapse of Atlantis or the Thule Society, they went east, and those who were left mated with native Asians, which is why Asian culture is superior to African culture, and why Hinduism and Buddhism are awesome religions, and Shinto. The Hindu and Indian theorists on this say, no, it all originated here and then we moved west. Doesn't matter that much. None of it's based in really rigorous science, but it does all link together in this idea of an Indo-Aryan superior race, which is why they all these right-wing groups choose the swastika. People see that as a superficial thing. That's important. Why are they picking an Indo-Aryan fertility symbol? And not just the Nazis, like all the German Order, all these occult groups, because it's such a common belief that that's where the Indo-Aryan race comes from, and religion and culture and certain occult powers, that you, of course, you're going to put a swastika on your book, on your flag, right? It's the substitute for the cross. And Chamberlain believes in that stuff. So that's why. And there's all sorts of interesting stuff in the Third Reich coming out of that. But Chamberlain's just one of many. Paul de Lagarde, Julius Langbehn, Theodor Fritsch, Lanz von Liebenfels. We could talk about all these thinkers who make similar arguments.
All right. Well, I know Eric will answer questions while he's signing books if anybody wants to dive deep on any of these endless topics. Thank you so much. Really incredibly fascinating.
Welcome. Thank you.